In the spring of 1964, a 3-sentence notice appeared on page 6 of the New Henley Sentinel, a small-town newspaper in western Massachusetts with a readership of barely 600. The headline was printed in lowercase, misaligned with the rest of the column. It read, "The Crimson Abbey will not reopen for the fall semester." There was no statement from the diocese, no quotes from the staff, no mention of the girls. For most readers, the announcement barely registered. The Crimson Abbey had been a silent structure for years, a Gothic stain of stone and vine at the edge of the pine woods. But for older residents of New Henley, those who remembered the days when the bell still rang at dawn and dusk, the silence wasn't peace, it was dread. And the notice wasn't news, it was confirmation. Behind the clipped language of the public statement lay something far older and more complicated. It is buried now in yellowed correspondence, in faded photos, in brittle diocesan ledgers marked with red slashes. One such document, a letter dated October 12, 1962, begins simply, "To whom it concerns, the grounds are quiet, but it is not rest. I believe it is containment." That letter was written by Harold Mayfield, the Abbey's last full-time groundskeeper. He had served the property for nearly 15 years, tending the overgrown cemetery, clearing the snow from the cloisters, oiling the rusted chapel doors that hadn't been opened to the public since 1948. He sent the letter anonymously to a newspaper in Springfield. It was never published, but it was preserved, stamped, filed, and later unearthed during a legal inquiry the diocese never acknowledged. The Crimson Abbey began not as a place of punishment, but of charity. At least that's what the early records suggest. Founded in 1891 under the name Sancti Crucis Domus, the estate was funded by a reclusive heiress named Edme Bradshaw, whose family made their fortune in textile mills in Lawrence and Fall River. The Abbey's official charter described it as a boarding institution for orphaned girls of moral temperament, overseen by the Sisters of the Radiant Martyr, a small but devout sect of the Catholic Church, headquartered then in Western Europe. Its location was intentional, remote, distant from the railways, shielded by trees that the original architects refused to cut down. Blueprints recovered in 1997 show that the Abbey's bell tower was constructed before the rest of the structure, its foundation deeper, its stone different, quarried from an unknown location, and ferried by wagon without documentation. The tower contains no staircase. The early years are sparsely documented. A few faded photographs show rows of girls in long woolen uniforms, arms folded, faces impassive. In one, dated 1913, 6 nuns stand behind the children. Only 3 are identified by name. The others are simply marked Sister of the Veil. By 1922, the Abbey's public presence had already begun to shrink. Visitors were no longer allowed inside the chapel. Letters sent by students were increasingly uniform in tone and phrasing. One letter from a 10-year-old named Clara Donnell was recovered from the estate of a local postmaster decades later. In it she writes, "We wake before the sun and wash in silence. The sisters say, our old names don't follow us here. I am learning to not speak unless spoken to. It is better this way." Clara's name does not appear in the Abbey's death records, but she is not listed among its graduates either. Over the years, the town of New Henley began to adjust to the Abbey's presence the way one adjusts to a distant, inoperable pain, by ignoring it. The locals stopped taking jobs on the grounds. Milk deliveries were left at the gate. A boy who tried to sneak into the cemetery in 1937 was found days later by a nearby river, unable to speak. The sheriff's department filed no report. The incident was described in a single sentence in the Sentinel's police blotter. Local youth found safe after misadventure. By 1949, the diocese had replaced the Abbey's clerical overseer 3 times in 4 years. No reason was ever given publicly, but internal memos, redacted, scanned, and leaked anonymously in the early 2000s, suggest the removals were not for misconduct. They were for exposure. One such memo, dated June 17, 1950, bears a warning. Father Altieri attempted to revise the registration books. When denied access to the 4th floor, he contacted Worcester. This is to be considered a breach. Recommend immediate reassignment. The fourth floor of the Abbey was never part of the original construction. It appears in no blueprints, is referenced in no inspection records, and is only visible in one photograph, a grainy image taken in the winter of 1963, showing the southern wing under heavy snow. Near the top window, a pale face can be seen looking down. The face is gaunt, elongated, unsmiling. The file beneath the image reads simply, Sister Therese, December 1963. She had become a fixture of the Abbey by then, not the abbess, not the founder, but something else. Her records, such as they are, place her birth in 1901. Yet in every photograph from the 1940s through the 1960s, she appears unchanged. Thin, severe, her hands always clasped, her gaze always level. It was Sister Therese who signed the final admission logbook, dated August 1962. It contains only 3 names, all of them girls under the age of 12. None of them have confirmed next of kin. Those who lived in New Henley at the time recall seeing fewer and fewer lights in the Abbey windows. One man, a retired fire inspector named Lawrence Dell, recalls being summoned for a code compliance visit in October 1963. He was not allowed past the second floor. He remembers the smell, something between candle wax and dried meat, and the silence, the complete crushing silence. He left after 22 minutes. When asked, decades later, why he didn't report what he saw, he said, "I think at some level I knew I wasn't supposed to see anything at all." The internal correspondence from the diocese in the final months is sparse. Most of the pages are missing, torn or marked, removed at clerical discretion. But one memo remains. It is typed on Archdiocese of Boston letterhead, signed only with the initials HV, and dated April 3rd, 1964. We are in agreement that further operation of the Crimson property is unwise. Formal closure is not to be pursued. No press, no ceremony. The matter ends here. File under Do Not File. No effort was made to sell the property. No official statement was released. The Abbey simply faded from the public record and from memory. When the gates finally rusted shut, they were not locked. They simply never opened again. But memory, even when buried, does not vanish. The town's children grew up hearing whispers of the girls who stopped writing home, of the sound the bell made when no one pulled the rope, of the sisters who stood too still for too long. And so when the New Henley Sentinel published its quiet notice in May 1964 that the Crimson Abbey would not reopen for the fall, no one protested, no one inquired, and no one, not even the most curious or brave among them, attempted to go inside. The story could have ended there, but it didn't, because that same month a photographer hiking the ridge behind the Abbey snapped a final image with a Polaroid SX70. In the photo, high in the 4th floor window, there is a figure, unmoving, watching, pale face, hands folded, no light in the room behind her. The timestamp reads May 19th, 1964, 3 weeks after the Abbey had been declared closed. The file containing the photograph is still sealed at the Worcester Diocesan Archive under the category Non-Investigated Material. But in the bottom right corner of the Polaroid, faint, handwritten in red ink, is a name, Sister Therese. The year was 1949. In the Diocese of Worcester's annual personnel report, among the many entries for parish transfers, retirements and deaths, there is a single blank space, line 78, where the name Thérèse d'Argonne should have appeared. No note of illness, no indication of reassignment, just an empty field, bracketed by the names of 2 other sisters from the Crimson Abbey, both of whom died within that same fiscal year. What makes this omission remarkable isn't just the absence of explanation, it's what came before, and more disturbingly, what came immediately after. In November of that year, 3 students at the Crimson Abbey were reported as having died during a winter fever outbreak, according to diocesan memos. Yet no such outbreak was recorded by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. The town of New Henley, the Abbey's jurisdictional district, registered no unusual death tolls, and no death certificates for the girls were filed at the local courthouse. Their names, if they ever had them, do not appear in school ledgers, cemetery logs, or baptismal records. Yet 1 year later, in October of 1950, Sister Therese's name quietly reappears in the Abbey's quarterly operation sheet. Not typed, not notarized, but written in deliberate cursive in the margins of the document beneath a redacted line. Her medical record too was reinserted into the Abbey's archive, this time on faded parchment with a forged diocesan seal. The attending physician's signature, scrawled in faint blue ink, matched no known staff at St. Joseph's Infirmary, the facility listed in the file. The entry simply reads, "Reinstated, vows remain unbroken, no further review necessary." What occurred between her removal and return has never been officially accounted for, but a single voice offered a glimpse, not from within the Abbey, but from a former outsider whose life was nearly consumed by it. His name was Thomas Greaves. In 1948, he was a young seminarian assigned briefly to the Crimson Abbey as part of his theological training. He never completed his ordination. By 1950, he had been expelled from seminary life. No reason was listed in the records. But in 1986, Greaves gave an anonymous taped interview to a journalist investigating clerical abuse cases in Massachusetts. His voice, though distorted for protection, carried the weight of experience and the tremor of memory. He spoke of what he called the confessional shifts, extended overnight sessions in which certain girls were brought into the chapel long after Vespers had concluded. These sessions, he claimed, were not supervised by priests. They were overseen by the sisters themselves and always concluded before sunrise. According to Greaves, the girls returned pale and trembling. He recalled one, Eliza, whose hands shook so violently she could no longer carry the communion tray. He also described hearing more than once the sound of furniture being dragged across stone floors long after curfew. The sound came not from the chapel or the dining hall, but from beneath the dormitories, in a place the staff referred to only as the lower passage. When he asked about it, he was told, gently but firmly, to pray for humility and not to question holy work. Greaves noted that illness was common in the Abbey, but it followed no clear pattern. It came and went without seasonal logic, often afflicting the same 5 or 6 girls repeatedly. Nosebleeds, night sweats, disorientation. One girl, he claimed, forgot her name entirely and began referring to herself by a number. By 1951, Greaves was gone. He never returned. What makes this testimony so disturbing is not its content, horrifying though it is, but its consistency with what little external evidence survived. That same year, in May of 1951, a girl was found unconscious along the western bank of the Merritt River, just 2 miles from the Abbey. She was discovered by a fisherman, her uniform soaked, her fingers raw, her teeth, all but 4, missing. She was never identified, and no missing persons report was filed by the Abbey. Her case was documented in the New Henley Sheriff's Department logbook as found juvenile, unclaimed, no residence confirmed. The girl was transferred to St. Catherine's Hospital in Springfield. Within 72 hours, she was gone, discharged into the custody of Abbey medical staff. That was the final note on her record. No follow-up, no forwarding address, and after that incident, the town's relationship with the Abbey changed, decisively. Deliveries of food and fuel, once brought by cart directly to the Abbey's rear service door, were instead left outside the wrought iron gate. Local businesses stopped renewing service contracts. Teachers who had once volunteered as part-time tutors declined to return. The police stopped responding to calls entirely. One former deputy, interviewed in 1991, described the standing order as "do not engage." When asked why, he looked away and said only, "There was no help to offer." What makes this chapter of the Abbey's history especially harrowing is how quietly it unfolded, how thoroughly the horror was folded into paperwork, absence and silence. There was no raid, no scandal, no newspaper campaign. The abbey, protected by ecclesiastical insulation and rural isolation, simply continued. Because in institutions like this, evil does not announce itself. It doesn't need to. It thrives on slow corrosion of oversight, of memory, of language itself. And the moment people stop asking questions, the damage begins to calcify into policy. The brief disappearance of Sister Therese, though never acknowledged publicly, seems to have marked a turning point in the abbey's internal operations. After 1950, documentation becomes increasingly sparse. The chapel's attendance logs vanish. Health reports cease entirely. By 1952, even birth records for incoming girls are no longer filed with the town clerk. The abbey no longer existed in the eyes of the public. It had become, in every functional sense, its own jurisdiction. And yet, within those sealed walls, the rituals continued. Sister Therese, now restored to her position, appears regularly in the few photographs that remain from that decade, always near the background, never smiling, always watching. The horror by then was no longer in what could be seen, it was in what had already been erased. In the summer of 1954, Father Albin Rowe, a travelling chaplain with the Archdiocese of Boston, was sent to the Crimson Abbey for a scheduled audit of religious practices. These were routine visits, meant to ensure that remote religious institutions remained in compliance with liturgical standards. According to the archived itinerary, his visit was to last 2 days. It lasted only 7 hours. Rowe arrived just after dawn. The air that morning was thick with late June humidity, and the grounds of the abbey, overgrown and untended, appeared more like an abandoned estate than an active institution. He was met not by a senior sister, but by 2 young girls, no older than 10, who led him wordlessly through the chapel entrance and then disappeared down a corridor before he could speak. His report, filed later that night, is unusually brief. It contains no theological observations, no mention of scripture or confession, just a series of notes written in increasingly erratic script under a hastily drawn heading, Liturgical Irregularities. Among the entries is the following: Bibles in girls' wing, all copies mutilated, pages 133-135 removed, surgical precision, no burn marks, children repeated, we are not meant to say those prayers anymore. When he asked the resident sisters about the missing passages, he was told the Bibles were under review. No explanation followed. He left the grounds that same afternoon and submitted a formal complaint. The complaint was archived, sealed and marked, resolved, canonical deviation, minor. No further action was taken. The pages in question, later confirmed by comparison to standard Catholic editions of the Douay Rheims Bible, contained 3 consecutive passages: Psalm 88, Luke 1:46, 55, and Revelation 3:7-13. All 3 focus on themes of divine mercy, the calling of the humble, and doors that shall not be shut. Their removal from every copy in the girls' wing was not a random act. It was deliberate, coordinated, and precise. The religious practices of the Crimson Abbey in the mid-1950s had already begun to diverge from Orthodox Catholicism. The signs were subtle at first: altered service times, removed crucifixes, silent vigils. But over time the changes grew more pronounced. Communion was no longer held at the altar, but distributed in silence without prayer. Midnight services were moved to the frost-covered garden behind the chapel, even in winter, where the girls stood barefoot in rows while the sisters hummed a single droning note. A former laundress at the abbey, Dolores Pennin, who worked part-time from 1953 to 1957, described witnessing one such service. Her written testimony, archived by her daughter and later published anonymously in a diocesan exposé, reads, "The girls were lined up like choir statues, not singing, not crying, just staring ahead. Sister Therese stood in front of them, her arms open, but not raised. The wind didn't move her veil. It was like she wasn't there to be touched by weather at all." One of the more disturbing discoveries tied to this period was made decades later during a structural survey of the chapel's foundation in 1981. the team hired to assess earthquake damage uncovered an alcove previously hidden behind a false panel near the confessional. Inside, they found 7 wooden booths, simple, aged and unlit, but each had been lined from top to bottom with waxed cloth. No ventilation, no kneelers, no soundproofing, just fabric, stiff, brown and tacky to the touch. And none of the surviving blueprints from the Abbey's 1891 construction mention the alcove. The materials used were also inconsistent with the rest of the structure. The timber was pine, not stone. The cloth lining appeared to have been applied in layers, preserved with wax likely sourced from melted altar candles. No records explained the alcove's function. No names were associated with its construction, but penciled into the wood beneath one of the booths, beneath 4 overlapping coats of varnish, were the faint, carved letters, "Be still and forget." It is around this same time, the summer of 1956, that the final letter from a Crimson Abbey student would be recovered. It was never mailed, it was never meant to be. The letter was written by a 13-year-old girl named Miriam Alcott. Her name does not appear on enrollment rosters, but she is referenced in 2 separate inspection logs by first name, and her handwriting was verified in comparison to samples found in the Abbey's prayer journals. The letter is dated July 2nd, 1956, and reads, in part, "Sister Therese does not walk, not anymore. She moves like the wind that doesn't make a sound. We aren't allowed to say the old prayers, the quiet nuns, the ones that never talk. They always look up when you pass, like they're waiting to see if you'll speak out loud. But I won't. I won't even think the old words." The letter was found behind a wooden floor panel in the West Dormitory during a renovation. It had been folded into a small brass locket and wrapped in a strip of muslin cloth, yellowed with age. The locket was unadorned, but the cloth bore a faint pattern of repeating crosses, one of which had been scratched out over and over until the thread frayed. There was no trace of Miriam in any medical or educational record after that date. She was never seen in the annual group photos. Her bed was later reassigned. The horror of this period in the Abbey's timeline lies not in a single event, but in its slow and silent transformation, from a place of declared faith into something closer to controlled erasure. By 1956, the rituals of Crimson Abbey were no longer recognisable to even the most flexible theologians. The Abbey was still operating, still feeding and clothing its residents, still receiving funding from the diocese. But it had ceased to function as a religious institution in any meaningful doctrinal sense. It had become something else. It had become a place where memory was suppressed through repetition, where scripture was edited into silence, and where children were taught not only to fear speaking, but to forget what speaking once meant. What makes this chapter so devastating is how easily it was missed. Bibles with missing pages can be explained. Night services can be excused. A girl who no longer writes home can be justified with the words, "difficult case." Evil here wore no horns. It wore habits and silence. And by the time anyone thought to ask what prayers the children had been forbidden to say, the children themselves no longer remembered them. With the mutilated scriptures archived and the chapel's hidden alcove sealed, the Abbey continued its quiet descent. By 1957, the diocese had stopped performing regular audits. The sisters no longer responded to letters, and those few who did come and go from the property spoke less and less. The Abbey was falling further from view, not by force but by design. And with that silence, the next phase was already beginning. By 1961, the Crimson Abbey had already faded from local memory, receding into the same shadowed category as shuttered mills and vanished rail lines. Yet that year, an initiative funded by a Boston Preservation grant ordered a structural inspection of the Abbey's tower as part of a failed plan to restore the grounds for historical tours. The contractor assigned to the job, Ledford and Sons Masonry of Hampshire County, dispatched 3 men to assess the bell tower's stability. They lasted 2 days. Not because of weather or wages, but because of what they didn't find. There were no stairs, no spiral ironwork, no ladder housing, just a vertical shaft that extended up 4 stories, cut from rough stone, with narrow footholds worn smooth by time. And something else. Spaced across the inner wall were rusted hooks set precisely every 27 inches, but none were attached to anything. No rail, no mechanism. The crew took photographs and submitted them to the town's zoning office. The tower, it seemed, had been built without internal access. Not overlooked, not incomplete, intentional. The original construction records, archived in the state's 1891 Religious Infrastructure Registry, list the tower as non-functional, aesthetic in nature, for spiritual ambience. The architectural plan filed with the diocese shows it shaded out entirely, just a blank grey cylinder beside the chapel's eastern wing. But in the town of New Henley, the tower was never considered decorative. It was something else entirely, a warning or a placeholder. By the 1930s, local boys were already daring one another to climb it from the outside, its crumbling mortar and protruding bricks making it an irresistible challenge for restless teenagers. Most gave up halfway. One reached the fourth-story slit window, glimpsed a shadow inside, and fell hard enough to break both wrists. In June of 1959, a boy named Calvin Trask did not return. He was 16, lived on Cinder Road. His parents reported him missing the next morning, and his bicycle was found by the gate of the Abbey, rusted and upright. According to the incident report filed by Deputy Alma Ridley, the tyre was still spinning when she arrived. The official cause of death was listed as presumed drowning in the Merritt River, though the river was over a mile away and showed no recent current. A search party was conducted but yielded nothing. His body was never recovered. The report was sealed 3 months later. That night, and on the same date every year after, several residents near the eastern tree line reported hearing the Abbey bell toll. Just once, a single sharp chime at exactly 3:17 a.m. It was not the sound of a modern bell, not hollow, not polished, more like something deep, dragged, a sound too old to be clean. The chime had no earthly reason to exist, because the tower had no visible bell, no access to hoist one, and no mechanism by which it could be rung. Records from the Abbey make no mention of it ever having been used. The oldest photo of the tower, dated 1895, shows no rope hanging from the outer frame. The bell slit is empty, and yet the sound returned, not nightly, but on specific precise dates. April 4th, 1937, June 12th, 1949, October 18th, 1951, each correlating to the last recorded sighting of a missing student. The diocese denied any correlation. In a 1962 memo marked "internal only," the incident was dismissed as rural folklore. But that same memo includes a note, handwritten in the margin: Ellis Mays paid cash for substructure work, tower, foundry smell. Request follow-up? Ellis Mays was a stonemason who had worked across the Tri-County region for over 40 years. In a taped interview recorded in 1982, 5 years before his death, he spoke for the first and only time about his work beneath the Abbey. The commission came in 1946, a private job, no contract, payment in 3 installments of $90, cash only. He was instructed to build a drainage channel beneath the bell tower's foundation. Not a normal drain, he said. Not stone, not tile, but a kind of venting system, angled downward and then horizontally toward the tree line. 5 feet deep, 4 feet wide. He was told not to ask why. The ground was harder than expected. The deeper he dug, the more the soil changed, from compact earth to clay, and finally to something darker, almost black. It left a metallic film on his tools, a bitter smell, something between iron and incense. He asked to terminate the job after 3 days. No explanation was needed. The man who paid him, Mays never knew his name, handed him a 4th envelope and said only, "You did the work, the rest isn't yours to carry." That drainage tunnel was never documented, its existence only confirmed by ground-penetrating radar in 2005, during a brief geological survey of the property. The equipment showed an angled passage extending from beneath the tower towards the woods, but the tunnel had collapsed long ago. The ground above it had sunken slightly, but not enough to draw notice. What makes this chapter of the Abbey's history so chilling is not what was built, but what was deliberately not built. The tower was designed to exist, but not to function. Its structure created not for use, but for containment. It was an object of ritual, not of utility, and yet someone had been inside. In 1963, during a final maintenance check before the abbey was sealed to the public, a municipal inspector named Peter Emmons attempted to climb the tower's internal shaft. He reached 12 feet before stopping. In his official write-up, he notes, "The handholds are uneven, not professionally cut. Rust visible on the metal. There is hair in the cracks. Human, long, not grey." He refused to continue the inspection, and in his final sentence, "The bell may not exist, but the sound does." Throughout this period, the diocese maintained silence. No formal statements were ever issued about the bell tower. No safety warnings, no modifications. It was simply allowed to stand, unvisited and unaltered. Its purpose, if it had one, remains buried in misfiled blueprints and forgotten oral accounts. But its effects remain. In 1971, 2 hikers passing along the abbey's western border claimed to hear stone groaning from within the tower at dusk. A forestry worker recalled spotting a flicker of light through the tower slit as he drove past one morning in 1983. And in 1994, a visiting historian named Melissa Brackley recorded ambient sound while photographing the abbey ruins. The tape was played once, never again. It contains, at the 3-minute 17-second mark, a noise like weighted iron on stone. The audio spike caused damage to the playback heads. Brackley left the property the next day and withdrew her research grant. What makes the bell tower so haunting is that it shouldn't exist. Not physically, not functionally. It was never meant to be climbed, never meant to be entered, never meant to ring. But it did. And when it did, someone always vanished. In early January of 1962, a fire broke out inside the choir room of the Crimson Abbey. The incident occurred just before dawn. The local fire department from New Henley arrived 17 minutes after the alarm was placed, but found the flames had already been extinguished. There was no visible damage to the chapel's exterior, no smoke, no burn odour, but inside one section of the choir loft floor had collapsed, exposing something beneath it that no one had expected. The floor had given way to a room not found on any blueprint. It sat just under the eastern wing of the chapel, sealed behind what appeared to be a false masonry wall. The air was heavy with lime and wool. Dust settled in layers thick enough to mute sound. There were no lights, no plumbing, no door, and yet the space was unmistakably prepared. 5 iron-framed beds were bolted directly into the stone. Each one was fitted with leather restraints, 2 at the wrists, 2 at the ankles. The floor had been padded with thick wool, tacked down with copper nails. Along the western wall stood a wooden table, heavily stained and warped from moisture, beside a shelf containing 3 thick ledgers, wrapped in oilcloth. Only one was labelled. It bore a single word on the cover, pressed in gold foil now mostly flaked away: failures. Inside, no names, no diagnoses, just lines of handwritten entries, each consisting of a date, a recorded temperature, and a number ranging from 1 to 5. One line read, March 9th, 1954, 97.80. Another, August 13th, 1955, 98.63. The writing was tight, precise. The pages were uncreased, as if never turned more than once. The structural team that discovered the room was part of a contracted preservation firm based out of Northampton. They were under strict diocesan agreement to report all anomalies immediately. The supervisor on site, Roger Linley, telephoned the Archdiocese of Worcester at 8:21 a.m. the same morning. By noon, the work order had been terminated. Linley's full written report does not survive. Only a single page remains, filed mistakenly with an unrelated invoice from 1965. On it, in hastily scrawled handwriting, is a short summary. Basement room under choir, unauthorised, secured W/limewash. No ventilation, no exit. Uninhabitable. Beds bolted, restraints intact. Recommend seal immediately. Purpose unknown. But Linley wasn't the only one who saw it. One of the contractors, Charles Fenwick, had taken photographs. Fenwick had worked for the firm for over a decade. He was 43 at the time, quiet, married, 2 children. According to his wife, he was not a man prone to exaggeration. When he returned home that night, he said only this: "They left it that way for a reason. It wasn't meant to be found." 2 months later, Fenwick was dead. The cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning, though investigators could find no source. His garage was ventilated. His car had not been running. No faulty heating system, no gas leaks. His death was ruled accidental. Case closed. But his wife, Helen Fenwick, kept his toolbox. And inside it, sealed in a manila envelope, were 5 photographs, faded, water-warped, but still partially legible. 3 showed the room. 1 showed the bed restraints, 1 the ledger, and 1, the final image, showed the far wall. On it, a faint silhouette, about the size of a child. Not drawn, not painted, more like a residue, a smudge shaped like someone sitting upright, facing away from the bed. The outline was just visible, like soot or mould that hadn't yet spread. There were no light fixtures in the room, no windows, no heat. Yet according to Fenwick's personal notes, also recovered from the toolbox, the room had been warmed to the touch. What makes this discovery especially disturbing is how it fits into the larger pattern of the Abbey's internal language, specifically a phrase that began to surface in whispered testimony during the late 1950s. Retreat therapy. The phrase appears once in an archived expense ledger from 1957 in a column labelled Special Program Supplies. It appears again, faintly penciled into the margins of a chapel logbook in 1960, beside a list of girls marked with an asterisk. And it appears in a journal belonging to Sister Therese. The diary, preserved in partial fragments after the Abbey's closure, contains a single passage that references the phrase, "Only the quietest remain. Those who forget the world may be shaped into something holy. In silence they retreat. In stillness they obey. We begin again with the empty ones." There is no record of retreat therapy in Catholic treatment manuals of the time. It does not appear in medical literature, but its function can be inferred. It was not designed to help. It was designed to erase, to strip identity, to induce compliance, to remold the child in a manner acceptable to the Abbey's vision of piety, without speech, without memory, without resistance. And while no victims were officially named, anecdotal evidence suggests otherwise. In 1965, a maintenance worker sent to reinforce the chapel's eastern foundation reported hearing a sound from beneath the floorboards, described as a low rhythmic tapping. He believed it to be rodents, but when he returned the next morning, the tapping had stopped. In the corner of the room, tucked beneath the collapsed subfloor, he found an old rosary. 1 bead had been cracked in half. The initials, LC, were carved into the back of the crucifix, scratched by hand with something sharp. The initials match a girl named Lucia Calderon, age 11, admitted to the Abbey in 1953. Her name disappears from the registry after 1956. No transfer, no graduation, no burial record. What makes this scene more than a horror of architecture is what it represents. The moment when the Abbey stopped pretending to be a sanctuary and began operating as a system. Prior to this, the signs were scattered. Missing records, odd rituals, whispered prayers. But this room, this chamber below the choir, marked a threshold. There was no accident, no ambiguity. This was a space designed for restraint, for isolation, for silence so total it restructured the self. In its design, in its concealment, in its intended function, it embodied one core principle: erasure. The kind of erasure that doesn't just make someone disappear, but makes their existence deniable. Not punished, not documented, just removed, as if they had never been. And perhaps most hauntingly, designed not out of sadism, but obedience. This was not rogue cruelty, it was policy. As the Abbey moved into the final years of its operation, the rooms beneath its floorboards told the truth the chapel above tried to hide. The stained glass still glowed, the incense still burned, but below, out of sight, the quiet ones were being shaped. With Charles Fenwick's photos passed down and recirculated in a 2002 estate sale, the public would get its first partial glimpse of what lay beneath the Crimson Abbey. 3 of the 5 images were eventually published in a regional journal on clerical abuse. The final 2, the silhouette and the ledger, remain unpublished. Their current whereabouts are unknown, but the photographs are not the only trace. The wall was resealed in 1963 under orders from the diocese, this time with reinforced concrete. Yet in the corner of the newly poured wall, still faintly visible beneath a patch of cracked lime, was the word failing. Singular, not plural, a correction perhaps, or a final confession. The Abbey's descent into total institutional horror was no longer theoretical. It had been carved into the stone, buried beneath the hymnals, and as the final years approached, the line between prayer and punishment would disappear entirely. By the autumn of 1963, the Crimson Abbey no longer received mail. The gates, long left open during daylight hours, remained chained shut. No deliveries, no arrivals, no departures. For the first time in its 72 years of operation, no new students were enrolled. The dormitory ledger, which had once listed 50 names per semester, showed only blank spaces. Yet despite all outward signs of closure, the Abbey was never officially listed as abandoned. According to diocesan property records, filed with the Archdiocese of Worcester and reviewed annually through the 1970s, it remained marked as active restricted access. The accompanying note read only, "Administrative hold pending review." Internally, however, operations had all but ceased. By mid-September, the Abbey's lay staff had been quietly dismissed. Tutors, cooks, groundskeepers, no replacements were hired. When asked, those few remaining sisters who answered the gate claimed the institution was transitioning to a contemplative model, though no such designation was ever registered with the church. Locals began to notice changes almost immediately. The women, once rarely seen outside the chapel, now walked the perimeter in slow, uniform circuits. Their movements were precise, almost metronomic, as if following patterns no one else could see. A boy from the nearby township of Shrewsbury, cutting through the woods with friends, later told his mother they were rehearsing something. He said the nuns walked without blinking, and that they all stopped at the same moment and turned their heads in unison towards the trees. Inside the building, things had shifted even further. In a state-maintained report from November of that year, submitted by an electrician contracted to inspect the chapel's breaker system, the floor plan of the upper dormitory showed several exits marked sealed, not locked, sealed with masonry, not wood. The doors to the east stairwell, the only access to the dormitory from the interior, had been plastered over and painted to match the stone. The contractor described the modification as invisible unless you were looking for it. He was not invited back. Furniture throughout the dorms and classrooms had been removed from its usual positions and arranged into circular formations. Desks were pulled away from walls, benches repositioned at slight angles. In one of the 4th floor study rooms, a table had been turned on its side and placed inside a ring of mirrors, none of which were fixed to the wall. No notes, no explanations, no light. The final known letter from Sister Therese was postmarked November 4th, 1963. It arrived without a return address, but carried the Abbey's official seal, embossed but partially smeared, as though stamped in haste. The letter was sent to the Diocesan Administrative Office in Springfield. The envelope contained only one page. It read, "No more forms, no more noise. The doors are shut to the world now. What remains is sacred." The letter was filed but never acknowledged publicly. The following day, the diocese changed the Abbey's internal status from operational to sanctioned private devotion. No visitation allowed, all inspections suspended. Yet what makes the silence of 1963 so terrifying was not simply its completeness, but its apparent purpose. This was not neglect, it was orchestration, and someone had been tasked with removing all signs of the outside world. That same winter, Alma Bridger, a janitor and former laundry assistant, who had worked part-time on the property for nearly 15 years, was called in to perform what she believed was a final cleaning contract. She was instructed to limit her time to the basement level and to avoid the chapel entirely. For years, Bridger had refused to speak publicly about her time at the Abbey. But in 1989, after being diagnosed with late-stage cancer, she granted a taped interview with her niece, who was conducting oral histories of religious workers in rural Massachusetts. What Alma described was not part of the official record. Her voice, shaky but calm, recounted the following. The basement incinerator had always been a place for waste linens, old bedding, worn robes, but that last time, they told me to clean around it only, not to touch anything inside. I waited until no one was around, then I looked. Inside the incinerator, 36 student uniforms. Neatly folded, pressed, not burned, not stained, just sitting, stacked in bundles, as if waiting to be passed down. Each one still bore the name tag of its previous wearer, stitched by hand, white on blue. Alma continued. There was no ash, nothing ever burned in there, but the smell, it wasn't rot, it was oil, like machine oil or candle wax. I can still feel it in my nose, even now. She also found something else. Inside a crate near the back of the laundry room, wedged between empty hymnals, was a leather-bound hymnal soaked through with what she described as dark oil. On every page, names had been written in the margins, one per line, dozens of names, all of them crossed out in red ink. Some names had been crossed out twice. There were no last names, no dates, just first names, many of which matched students listed in the Abbey's internal records from the previous decade. Alma recognised at least 5. The final page of the hymnal was blank, except for a short inscription written in a different hand. Their voices have left them, but their silence belongs to us. She left the book where she found it. She never returned to the Abbey again. What makes the events of 1963 particularly disturbing is the contradiction they represent. On paper, the Abbey was still alive, active even. The utilities remained connected. Property taxes were waived under ecclesiastical exemption. The buildings were structurally maintained, but inside there was no education, no liturgy, no community. There was only ritual, and those rituals were no longer about salvation. They were about preservation, about the containment of something that had been allowed to grow in silence, unchecked. A pattern emerged in the weeks that followed. More lights were seen at odd hours, but never flickering, always constant, glowing softly behind closed drapes. Visitors who approached the grounds to take photographs reported a strange sensation, like the pressure of altitude, or the moment just before fainting. The Abbey had withdrawn from the world, not in neglect, not in fear, but in deliberate preparation. Because what followed next was not collapse, it was culmination. From the scattered reports, it became clear that the nuns were not lost, or trapped, or failing. They were readying. One final note emerged decades later, buried in an unrelated lawsuit regarding diocesan land reassignment. It was a maintenance log, filed by a courier who had attempted to deliver building materials to the Abbey in December 1963. He was turned away at the gate by a sister he did not recognise. When he asked for a signature, she pointed to a clipboard. Next to recipient name, a line had been drawn through the field. In its place, written in block capitals, was one word: completed. The same word appeared again, weeks later, in a requisition form for fuel. This time, in the section labelled Comments. Heat no longer required, process completed. The horror of 1963 is not in what was done, it's in what was finished. The silence was not a void, it was an achievement, an end state. Something the Abbey had been building toward for decades. It was the year the gates closed, not to keep the world out, but to keep something in. With the diocese choosing to preserve the fiction of its operation for another 16 years, what happened inside those walls would remain sealed, physically, institutionally, spiritually. And as for Sister Therese, her final letter remains the only direct communication ever found after November 1963. It is held in a sealed archive at the Worcester Archival Depository, catalogued under restricted clergy files. The last known line she ever wrote is scrawled beneath her signature, added in pencil. Barely legible. But it reads, "It is quiet now, it is right." In the spring of 1980, a priest named Father Daniel Voss began compiling what he would later call the most damning collection of truths I've ever assembled beneath a crucifix. At the time, Voss worked quietly as an archivist for the Archdiocese of Hartford. He had no parish of his own, no sermons, no flock. His assignment was administrative, tasked with cataloguing inconsistencies in diocesan housing reports from the mid-century. Most of what he reviewed were dull: heating invoices, improperly signed leases, internal maintenance disputes. But in July of that year, while cross-referencing clergy residency transfers in Worcester, he encountered a file with no cover sheet, labelled simply Crimson. The folder contained a tangle of redacted memos, carbon copies of letters never sent, requisition forms marked void, and something far stranger: a single sheet bearing the Vatican seal, written in Latin, that mentioned a term Voss had never seen before: nullificatio spiritus, spiritual nullification. He didn't know then what it meant, but he kept a copy, and he kept looking. Over the next 5 years, Father Voss constructed what the Church would later attempt to erase entirely: a full investigative report into the real function of the Crimson Abbey. His 108-page dossier was never published. It was never acknowledged by the diocese. Officially, it does not exist. But it has a title: Clerical Experimentation and Spiritual Nullification, Project Crimson. And it confirms what those who lived near the Abbey had long suspected. The Crimson Abbey was not simply a religious institution that failed. It was a psychological experiment, designed from the beginning to see how much of the human soul could be silenced under the banner of sanctity. According to Father Voss's report, Project Crimson was a pilot program initiated in the 1920s by a small but influential circle of Vatican officials associated with the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life, a department tasked with overseeing religious orders. These men, all unnamed in surviving records, sought to test whether complete submission to divine structure could be induced rather than taught, by removing the traditional barriers of will, memory, and identity. The test group, orphaned girls under the age of 13, preferably without family, preferably without record. They were to be placed in a setting that mimicked religious purity, but in reality functioned as a containment site, a place where language, individuality, and personal connection could be slowly dismantled and replaced with ritual obedience. The Crimson Abbey was constructed for that purpose. Every architectural detail, from the unbroken corridors to the sealed bell tower, was intentional. The layout prevented orientation. The echoing walls created the illusion of surveillance, and the absence of clocks or calendars erased the sense of time. Daily schedules emphasized repetition. Food was plain and indistinguishable. Names were discouraged. Voice use was restricted. Prayer became mantra. Confession became silence. But what Voss uncovered next changed everything. The nuns themselves, the women who ran the abbey, had once been subjects. A letter found in the Vatican archives, stamped 1932 and marked eyes only, describes the elevation of one TD, presumed to be Thérèse d'Argonne, to the role of senior overseer, following what the document chillingly describes as successful nullification through deprivation and reprogrammed doctrine. The report states that Sister Thérèse was the first to complete the cycle, that she no longer required external validation, language, or identity, that she had become, in their words, a conduit for sacred reshaping. It was then, and only then, that she was given authority over the other sisters, women who had also been selected, groomed, and reshaped through isolation. The Abbey's hierarchy was not ordained, it was engineered. And from that point forward, what happened inside those walls was not worship, It was erasure. Voss's report includes case files pulled from sealed clerical mental health evaluations. These files were not meant to be seen. One in particular, dated 1955, describes a girl who had not spoken in 18 months. When prompted with her birth name, she did not respond. When asked to recite the Lord's Prayer, she repeated the words, "We belong to silence," 12 times. Her file was stamped discontinued. No burial, no discharge, no explanation. The scope of the project expanded quietly. In 1958, new protocols were tested. These included the introduction of auditory disorientation, whispered prayer recordings played during sleep hours, and the strategic reintroduction of ritual sounds, bell tones, footstep pacing, and synchronized chants. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in Voss's dossier is a series of magnetic, reel-to-reel tapes recovered from a locked drawer inside the Abbey's choir loft. They were found by accident in 1979 during an estate audit, catalogued as audio materials, unknown content. There were 7 tapes in total, labelled only with Roman numerals. Tape 3, recorded in 1958, contains 6 continuous hours of whispered Latin, much of it nonsensical, drawn from fragments of psalms, gospel lines, and apocryphal texts. But halfway through the 5th hour, a change occurs. One voice emerges, female, calm, deliberate, speaking in English. She says, "The world is not what we were told, we unmake it here." The voice repeats the phrase every 6 minutes, over and over, until the end of the tape. Voss had the voice analysed. Though the sample quality was poor, he believed it to be Sister Therese. This aligns with a chilling entry in one of her few surviving journals. "To undo the world is to undo the noise. The noise makes us remember. The silence makes us holy." The Vatican refused to comment on the tapes. Voss believed the experiment was never about faith. It was about control, about the capacity of religious authority to overwrite the human mind entirely, to replace conscience with compliance. He traced references to Project Crimson in a total of 19 separate Vatican memos between 1931 and 1967. All used euphemistic language: devotional acceleration, purity through retreat, discipline beyond self. One letter, dated October 1944, states, "Early phase subjects are still resisting auditory nullification. Consider extended deprivation models. Monitor temperature loss and eye response. TD shows continued promise." The letter was signed only with the initials VL, but the Church never formally acknowledged Project Crimson, and by 1987 they erased nearly all records. That year, Father Voss's report, completed in full, with 18 appendices and audio transcriptions, was presented to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Within 2 months, the entire document was classified. All physical copies ordered destroyed, but one copy survived. Voss, fearing the report would be buried, mailed a sealed duplicate to a journalist named Brendan Callahan, a freelance religion correspondent working out of Albany. Callahan never published the story. 2 weeks after receiving the report, his home burned to the ground. The fire marshal's report lists the cause as electrical malfunction. The case was closed. Callahan's body was found in the hallway, less than 5 feet from the exit. No trace of the dossier was ever found at the scene. But in 1999, Callahan's former roommate donated a locked box to a historical society in upstate New York. Inside were personal effects: a camera, letters, and a microfilm strip labelled in faded ink. Crimson Voss. The contents matched Voss's original report word for word. One paragraph stands out above the rest. Project Crimson was never meant to be exposed. It was not a failure, it was a proof of concept. The subjects were never expected to return to society. The experiment ends not with recovery, but with completion. Completion, in this case, means total erasure of self, the nullification of spirit, a quiet that consumes identity until nothing remains but obedience. The Abbey was not abandoned, it was fulfilled. Voss died in 1994, officially natural causes. His grave is unmarked. The report is now stored in 3 separate anonymous archives, each bearing different custodianship. The Vatican maintains no comment on its contents. But one undeniable truth remains. The Crimson Abbey was not a deviation. It was a design. From its first stone to its final silence, it functioned as a laboratory. One built not with test tubes or electrodes, but with scripture, shame, and subtraction. The horror was not what was done to the children. It was the purpose they were shaped for. And perhaps most unsettling of all, those behind Project Crimson did not view it as cruelty. They viewed it as devotion perfected. To remove the self, they believed, was to bring one closer to God. But what they created was not sanctity. It was void. A void that hummed beneath stained glass, that whispered under candlelight, that rang in a bell tower with no stairs. What makes this revelation more than just institutional failure is its philosophical weight. Because what Father Voss uncovered, what so many never lived to see, is the ultimate indictment of obedience without question. A system that replaces thought with repetition, language with mantra, will with surrender, not to protect, not to save, but to erase. And when the silence came, the Church closed the file, redrew the borders of memory, and labelled the project with a word that is still used in internal code logs to this day. Completed, with the Abbey sealed, its documents buried, and its victims unnamed, the next chapter would not be about what happened within those stone walls. It would be about what refused to stay buried, because in a field behind the Abbey's chapel, the ground was beginning to sink, and small stone crosses, unmarked, unblessed, had begun rising through the soil. In the spring of 2003, a boundary inspection crew from the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Office visited a property just outside the Pinewoods of New Henley, an overgrown site still officially listed as Clerical Institutional Property, Restricted Access, the Crimson Abbey. Though inactive for more than half a century, the Abbey has never been demolished, condemned, or publicly repurposed. Its gates remain locked. The buildings, though crumbling, are structurally sound, and its legal ownership has passed quietly through a succession of private trusts, each more opaque than the last. No signage marks its presence. There is no website, no listed phone number, and yet each year the taxes are paid. The perimeter is maintained, and the air around it, locals say, still smells faintly of wet copper and candle ash, especially in summer. Children born near the Abbey tend to know more than they should. In the small farming village of Dalton, 9 miles south of New Henley, a 3rd grade teacher began recording student drawings in the early 2000s after noticing a pattern. Multiple children, unprompted, depicted a tall, black stone tower, windowless, featureless, yet always looming behind a chapel. Several included stairs that stopped halfway up. Others drew a narrow slit near the top, with no ladder leading to it. When asked, one child said only, "That's where the women go when they forget." None of these children had visited the property. Most had never heard the name Crimson Abbey. But all of them said the same thing about their dreams. The tower had no stairs, but they kept climbing anyway. The Abbey was not forgotten, not completely, because even when structures fall silent, the ground remembers. Over the last 2 decades, hikers, hunters, and amateur photographers passing behind the chapel's eastern slope have reported finding small stone crosses, hand-carved, weathered, and partially sunken in the mud. They are not decorative. They are not part of any known graveyard. There is no formal cemetery registered on the Abbey's blueprints, and diocesan records list only 13 deaths on the property between 1891 and 1961, all attributed to illness or accident. Yet by conservative count, over 50 of these crosses have been seen. They emerge slowly, appear near the base of a dead tree, at the edge of a drainage ditch, at the bottom of the slope, behind the former choir room. No one sees them being placed, no one takes credit for them, and by late fall they vanish again, not stolen, not removed, but sinking, as if drawn back into the soil that once tried to bury them. The crosses are always the same shape, vertical, narrow, with sloped shoulders. Most are unmarked. One bore a single etched letter, M. Another had 13 scratches on its right side, deliberate, evenly spaced. The kind used to count time without a calendar. Locals don't disturb them. Children are told not to touch them. And in nearby gas stations and diners, if the abbey is mentioned at all, the phrase most often whispered is, "It's still quiet there. That's what's wrong." In 2021, a graduate student from Tufts University named Evan Claiborne attempted to map the abbey's subterranean structure using ground-penetrating radar. He was denied access to the building, but received limited permission to scan the surrounding acreage from a former member of the trust board who claimed, off record, to be tired of being silent. Claiborne's equipment identified multiple subsurface voids, irregular in shape, spaced unevenly, and aligned in a rough semicircle behind the chapel. He returned 2 weeks later to confirm the findings. By then, the gates had been welded shut. His contact had vanished. No further access was granted. But the last photo on Claiborne's camera, taken from outside the fence line, showed something unexpected. Near the edge of the woods, where no path existed, was a new cross. Freshly carved, standing straight. The photo was time-stamped 3:17 a.m. That was the last time he returned to the site. In 1989, long before the rise of public interest in the abbey, a reporter for the Boston Record named Clara Ingram conducted a series of anonymous interviews with former religious workers in Massachusetts. One of those interviews never aired. It was with a woman in her 80s living under hospice care near the Vermont border. Her name was redacted from the transcript, but what she said, Clara later wrote, was the only moment in her career that made her question whether journalism had the tools to handle certain truths. The woman had been a novice at the Crimson Abbey until 1957. She described her role as obedient prayer support, a term that appears nowhere in formal doctrine. She spoke of silence drills, of hours spent blindfolded in a tiled room, of memory fasts, where the nuns were forbidden to think of family, forbidden even to form images of loved ones. She was eventually dismissed, not for wrongdoing, but because, in her words, "I remembered my sister's name. That made me unfit." At the end of the interview, Clara asked her if she ever truly understood what the abbey had been for. The woman began to cry, quietly, as if the sound itself felt disloyal. She said, "We wanted to serve God, but they gave us something else to worship." That tape was sealed at Clara's request. She never aired the interview, but she kept a copy. Years later, her notes were donated to a historical archive. On the inside flap of her notebook was a single quote, circled in red ink, "Do not dig." In the diocesan archives of St. Leander's Cathedral, where the Crimson Abbey's few surviving ledgers are kept in a temperature-controlled vault, one particular ledger contains a final, handwritten margin note, likely from a senior cleric, judging by its placement near the end of the building's operating file. It reads, "Do not speak of the Crimson Project. Do not dig. Let what is buried stay buried." That instruction has been followed. To this day, no excavation has been permitted. No investigation has been opened. No apology has been issued. And yet something keeps rising. The land itself, indifferent to secrecy, continues to breathe up quiet reminders. Symbols carved by hands no one sees, crosses that return each year, names that come back only in dreams. The Crimson Abbey was never condemned. It was never formally closed. On paper, it still exists, suspended in administrative purgatory. But if you ask the people who still live nearby, they'll tell you something that doesn't appear in any file. That sometimes, when the ground is soft from rain, you can walk behind the chapel and see footprints where no one's walked. That the air still hums at night, not loud but low, like breath held too long. That the silence there feels stacked, like layers. And that if you stand too long near the edge of the woods, the world begins to tilt. Not physically, not enough to make you fall, just enough to remind you that something underneath is still watching. still listening, still waiting.